The morning that Harlan Abbott rode into Caldwell, Kansas, with nothing but a worn saddle, a bay horse named Copper, and the better part of a bad reputation trailing behind him, was the same morning that Augusta Redmond learned she had been given away in a dead man's will. The year was 1878, and the town of Caldwell sat on the edge of Kansas like a man perched on a fence, unsure whether to fall north into civilization or south into the wild and lawless territories that still breathed with the old dangers. Cattle drives came through like rivers, loud and dusty, and full of sunburned men who spent their wages in a single night. Saloons never fully closed their doors. The law was a courtesy rather than a certainty, and everyone who came to Caldwell was either running from something or running toward it. Harlan Abbott was doing both, though he would not have admitted it under threat of anything short of a Bible placed directly in his hand. He was 31 years old, lean in the way that hard work and little food will make a man lean, with dark hair that curled just slightly at his collar, and eyes the color of river water in November, gray and still, and too deep to read quickly. He had been a ranch hand for most of his adult life, working other men's cattle on other men's land, and he had grown accustomed to the particular loneliness of that life in the way that some men grow accustomed to a stone in their boot. They do not enjoy it. They simply stop expecting it to go away. He had come to Caldwell because a man named Chester Greer had written him a letter 6 weeks ago, and the letter had said that Harlan's uncle, one Wallace Abbott, had died of a fever up in Wichita and had left certain holdings to be collected. Harlan had not known his Uncle Wallace particularly well. The man had passed through Harlan's life twice, once when Harlan was 7, bringing a peppermint stick and a smell of horses, and once when Harlan was 19, lending him $20 that Harlan had paid back within the year. He had not thought of Wallace Abbott in a decade, which made the letter from Chester Greer strange and somewhat unsettling, the way all unexpected inheritances feel unsettling to a man who does not expect to be remembered. Chester Greer's letter had been brief. It had said, "Come to Caldwell. There is a will. You are in it. Do not delay." Harlan had not delayed. He had finished his last week of work on the Milligan Ranch outside of Abilene, collected his wages, saddled Copper, and ridden south. He tied his horse at the post outside the attorney's office, which was a modest building of whitewashed plank between the barber and the general store, and he pushed through the door into a small room that smelled of ink and dust and the faint sweetness of pipe tobacco. There were 2 people already inside. Chester Greer himself was one of them, a small, precise man of perhaps 55 with wire-rimmed spectacles and the permanently ink-stained fingers of a man who dealt in documents. He rose when Harlan entered and extended a hand, and Harlan shook it. The second person in the room was a woman, and Harlan noticed her the way a man notices unexpected weather, with an immediate, involuntary attention that had nothing to do with choice. She was seated in one of the 2 chairs before Chester Greer's desk, and she did not rise when Harlan entered, though she turned her head and looked at him with a directness that was not rude but was thoroughly unafraid. She was perhaps 25, with dark auburn hair pinned at the back of her neck in a manner that looked as though it had started the morning orderly and was losing the argument with the afternoon. Her eyes were a clear amber brown, warm as firelight, and her face was the kind of face that had learned early that prettiness was a tool of limited use and had developed other, more durable qualities instead, a certain steadiness, an intelligence in the set of her brow, a composure that was not cold but simply self-contained. She wore a simple dress of navy wool that had been mended at one cuff with careful, small stitches. Her hands, folded in her lap, were not the hands of a woman who had been kept indoors. There were calluses at her fingers, a small scar near her left thumb, and a slight roughness to her knuckles that spoke of outdoor labor and the honest indignity of it. She looked at Harlan for exactly as long as it took to form an opinion, and then she looked back at Chester Greer. "This is him, then," she said. It was not a question. "This is Harlan Abbott," Chester Greer confirmed, gesturing to the second empty chair. "Please sit down, Mr. Abbott. Miss Redmond has been waiting." Harlan sat. He placed his hat on his knee and looked from the attorney to the woman and back again. "The letter said there was a will." "There is," Chester Greer said. He opened the folder on his desk with the precise movements of a man who has performed a specific ceremony many times and has learned not to rush it. "Your uncle, Wallace Abbott, drew up this will 14 months before his death. He had it notarized in Wichita in the spring of 1877 and instructed me to locate both of you in the event of his passing." "Both of us," Harlan repeated slowly. Chester Greer folded his hands on top of the document. "Wallace Abbott was a man of unconventional sentiments," he said carefully. "He was, in his later years, a close friend of Jonas Redmond, who was Miss Redmond's father. Mr. Redmond passed away 2 years ago, leaving Miss Redmond with a small property but no male family member to assist her in certain legal and practical matters. Mr. Abbott had no children of his own. He was fond of Miss Redmond, who he knew since she was a child, and he was fond of you, Mr. Abbott, in the way that men are fond of people they have not seen in a long time but still think well of." "Get to the point, Mr. Greer," Augusta Redmond said quietly. There was no sharpness in it. It was just a woman who had been sitting in that chair for a while already and wanted the business concluded. Chester Greer cleared his throat. "The will stipulates that Wallace Abbott's holdings, which include 160 acres of land south of town with a standing house and a small herd of cattle, as well as a sum of $400 in bank notes, be transferred jointly to his nephew Harlan Abbott and to Augusta Redmond, on the condition that they enter into a legal marriage within 60 days of the reading of this will." The room went quite still. Harlan looked at the attorney. Then he looked at Augusta. She was looking at the window, her jaw set, her expression unreadable. "He left me a wife," Harlan said flatly. "He left me a husband," Augusta said, with precisely the same intonation. A short silence passed between all three of them. "The land cannot pass to either party singly," Chester Greer added, because he was a man who believed in complete information. "If neither party agrees to the terms, the property reverts to the county. The $400 is likewise contingent." Harlan looked at Augusta Redmond again. She turned from the window and looked back at him, and for a long moment they regarded each other with the frank, measuring attention of two people trying to decide whether the other is dangerous. Then something shifted very slightly in her expression, and it was not anger. "I suppose," Augusta said slowly, "that your uncle and my father were considerably more optimistic about practical arrangements than most people are." "My uncle was a man who thought he knew better than everyone," Harlan said. "He was right about it often enough to be insufferable." Augusta pressed her lips together, and he realized after a moment that she was suppressing something, not quite a smile, but the ancestor of one. "Miss Redmond," Harlan said, and he heard his own voice come out more careful than he intended, "I have no claim on you and no desire to make one that you don't agree to. If you want to walk out that door and leave the land to the county, I will think nothing less of you for it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Do you have land of your own, Mr. Abbott?" "No." "Do you have a house?" "No." "Do you have any kind of establishment at all?" "A horse," he said. "Good horse, too." "I have a house," she said. "My father's house. But the roof needs repair I cannot pay for, and the cattle I have 12 head need more land than my 40 acres allows, and I have been doing the work of 2 people for 2 years, and doing it tolerably well but not quite well enough to keep ahead of it." She looked down at her folded hands and then back up at him. "I'm not looking for someone to manage my affairs for me. I have managed my own affairs well enough." "I believe you," Harlan said. "I am looking," she said more carefully, "for someone to work alongside if that person exists." The way she said it made it clear that she had some doubt about whether such a person existed, but that she was willing to conduct the inquiry. "I have been a ranch hand for 11 years, Harlan said. "I can repair a roof. I can work cattle. I have never once in my life been anything other than honest, and I have the occasional temper, but I do not take it out on people who have not earned it." Augusta was quiet for a moment. "Are you angry?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "About the will? No, confused maybe. Your father and my uncle seem to have thought very highly of us both, which I find I am more grateful for than irritated by." He paused. "Are you angry?" She considered him. "No," she said, and there was a note of mild surprise in her own voice, as if she had expected to be and was somewhat thrown off by the absence of it. "I should probably be." Respectable women in 1878 are supposed to be outraged at being handed over in a legal document like a piece of property. "And yet," he said. "And yet," she agreed, "my father knew me better than I sometimes knew myself. If he spoke well of you to your uncle, and your uncle wrote it into a will, then I expect there is a reason for it." She unclenched her hands from her lap and straightened her spine. "I am not agreeing to a marriage, Mr. Abbott. Not today. But I am agreeing to a conversation." "That seems fair," Harlan said. Chester Greer, who had been sitting behind his desk in the careful stillness of a man who has learned to remove himself from emotionally charged proceedings, cleared his throat again. "You have 60 days, he reminded them both. "The will is quite specific." "Then we have time to have a conversation," Augusta said, and she rose, and she put on her hat, and she looked at Harlan Abbott one more time with those clear amber-brown eyes. "My property is 3 miles south on the main road. There is a broken fence post at the gate, which I will ask you not to read as a symbol, as it is simply a fence post that needs replacing and not a statement about my general condition." Harlan stood because his mother had raised him to stand when a woman stood, regardless of everything else. "I'll come by tomorrow morning if that suits you." 7 o'clock, she said. "I keep early hours." "So do I." She nodded once with the brisk efficiency of a person concluding a business meeting, and then she walked out the door, and the little bell above the frame rang as it closed, and the room felt very noticeably different without her in it. Harlan stood there for a moment looking at the door. Then he looked at Chester Greer. "She is not what I expected," Harlan said. "No one who meets Miss Redmond gets what they expected," Chester Greer said, with the particular warmth of a man who admires someone from a respectful distance. "Her father was a fine man. She has her mother's backbone, God rest her. And she is not easy, Mr. Abbott, but she is good, which I have found in my years is a considerably rarer thing." Harlan put his hat back on his head. "Was the land my uncle's, or did he acquire it for the purpose of this arrangement?" "He acquired it," Chester Greer said. "He bought it from a family heading to Oregon 14 months ago, right after he drew up the will. He chose it specifically." He looked at Harlan over his spectacles. "He said it was good land. Enough water, good grass, a house that needed some work but nothing a capable man couldn't manage. He said Miss Redmond's land and this land bordered each other, so that together they would be a real working ranch." Harlan absorbed this. His uncle had bought land, drawn up a will, arranged 2 lives with the confidence of a man who fully expected the universe to cooperate, and then had the grace to die and let the arrangement stand without him. It was either the most presumptuous thing a man had ever done, or the most generous. He was not entirely sure it was not both. "Thank you, Mr. Greer," he said, and he went out into the afternoon sun of Caldwell. He stood on the wooden walkway in front of the attorney's office and looked down the main street of town. The saloons and the dry goods and the livery stable and the wooden water tower at the far end. And the wide Kansas sky above it all, impossibly blue. The kind of sky that made a man feel simultaneously very small and very free. He could see the rooftop of what he thought might be the hotel. And beyond the rooftops, the flat open land of the territory stretched away in every direction, golden with late summer grass. He untied Copper from the post and led him to the livery for water and grain. And he stood there watching his horse drink and thought about Augusta Redmond's hands, and the careful stitching on her cuff, and the way she had said, "I am not looking for someone to manage my affairs for me," as though she had needed to say it so many times before that it had worn smooth with use. He thought about 160 acres and $400 and a roof that needed repair. He thought about 11 years of working other men's land, sleeping in other men's bunkhouses, eating other men's food, and the particular cold feeling of having nothing that was his except his horse and his saddle, and whatever was left of his wages after the month was out. He thought, Wallace Abbott, you old interfering man, you might have gotten this right. The next morning, Harlan Abbott rode south at 6:45, arriving precisely on time at the gate of the Redmond property, where the broken fence post stood exactly as advertised, tilting at a 45-degree angle with the air of a man who had simply given up one afternoon and never recovered. Harlan resisted the urge to straighten it before going in, because she had specifically asked him not to read it as a symbol, which meant she had anticipated that someone would, and he found he did not want to be predictable. The property was 40 acres of good mixed grass with a stand of cottonwood trees along the east edge where a creek made a silver line in the morning light. The house was small but solid, a story and a half of whitewashed plank and stone foundation with a covered porch that ran the length of the front. There was a kitchen garden to one side, still producing in the late summer heat, and a small barn behind the house that had been recently repaired on one wall. The 12 head of cattle he had been told about were visible in the south pasture, grazing with the unhurried contentment of cattle everywhere. Augusta Redmond was at the fence of the kitchen garden when he rode up, and she was already working, pulling something from the earth with the focused effort of someone who had a full day planned, and had allocated exactly this many minutes to this task before moving on to the next. She looked up when she heard Copper's hooves on the hard-packed dirt, and she straightened and wiped her hands on her apron. "Mr. Abbott," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not warm yet but was not closed either, a door slightly ajar. "Miss Redmond," he said, and dismounted. She walked to the fence and he walked to the fence, and they stood on opposite sides of it, which he thought was probably appropriate for where they were in the acquaintance. "Come look at the land your uncle bought," she said. "Then come look at mine. I want you to understand what the arrangement would mean in practical terms before we discuss anything else." She was wearing a different dress today, a gray-blue cotton with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and her hair was pinned more securely than it had been the day before, though there was a strand at her temple that had already escaped. She showed him her land the way someone introduces a person they love, with attention and care and the slight defensiveness of knowing the other person might not see it the way you see it. She showed him the creek, and where it dried up in a drought year, and the south pasture where the grass was good, and the north pasture where it had thinned and needed rotation, and the barn where her 2 horses, a chestnut mare and a small brown mule, stood regarding Harlan with the deep suspicion that horses reserve for strangers. She showed him the roof of the house, where 2 boards had warped and lifted, and where the rains had been leaking into the corner room upstairs. She showed him the well, which was good and deep, and the smokehouse, which was solid, and the root cellar, which was stocked with the careful thoroughness of a woman who had survived a hard winter alone and intended never to be caught unprepared again. Then she walked him 3/4 of a mile along the fence line between her property and the land that had been his uncle's, and the fence line was a low thing of old wire and cedar posts, some of which leaned and some of which had already gone down. "The land on the other side is better," she said, simply and without bitterness. "More water. The house needs work, but the bones of it are sound." Together, the 2 properties would be a real cattle operation. Separated, they are both just barely enough. She said it like a woman reading a map, and Harlan respected that deeply. They walked the boundary of the second property, which was indeed good land rolling grass, a reliable-looking stock pond in the northwest corner, and a stand of timber along the creek that represented real winter fuel. The house was a single story of limestone and wood, larger than Augusta's, with a porch on 2 sides and a barn that needed 1 wall and a new roof, but was otherwise a good structure. "I can fix the barn," Harlan said, because it was the most straightforward thing he could say, and he needed to say something straightforward. Augusta looked at him. "What I want to know, Mr. Abbott, is who you are when there is no one watching." The plainness of it stopped him for a moment. He turned to look at her properly, standing there in the morning light with the Kansas prairie behind her, and he thought that this was a woman who had learned the hard way that character was the only reliable currency, and who had therefore stopped accepting substitutes. "I do not know how to prove that to you except by time," he said. "But I'll tell you what I can tell you. I am not a man who drinks past reason. I have never struck a woman or a child, and I never would. I have a bad temper sometimes, and when it gets away from me, I go walk it off rather than spend it on someone. I have never stolen, and I have always worked, and I have sometimes been lonely, but I have not let that make me cruel." He paused. "I am not a finished man, Miss Redmond. I expect I have a good deal of growing yet to do, but I think I am growing in the right direction." She listened to all of this with the still, careful attention she gave to everything, and when he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "My father thought well of your uncle," she said, "and your uncle thought well of you." "My father was not a sentimental man, and he was a good judge of character." "What was he like?" Harlan asked. "Your father." Something shifted in her face, a softening, quick and then controlled again, like sunlight moving briefly across a hillside. "He was a hard man in the way that this country makes men hard," she said. "He believed in work and honesty and keeping your word, and he taught me that land was something worth taking care of, not just something to stand on." She looked out over the grass. "He died of a fever too, like your uncle. It was fast, which I am grateful for. He did not suffer long." She paused. "He did not tell me before he died that he had spoken to your uncle about this. I found out yesterday at the same time you did." "Are you angry with him for that?" Harlan asked carefully. She thought about it honestly, the way he had thought about his own answer the day before. "I was, for about 20 minutes yesterday afternoon," she said. "And then I thought about it more carefully, and I thought he arranged things. He always arranged things. He could not leave without making sure I was arranged for." She did not say this with self-pity. She said it with the mix of exasperation and affection that is the exclusive province of people who have lost someone who loved them. "He could not ask me whether I wanted it because I would have said no, and then he would have worried about me for however long he had left, which was not long. So he did it without asking me, and he left me to deal with the results of it." "He sounds like my uncle," Harlan said. "I expect they understood each other very well," Augusta said. She looked at him, and the directness of her gaze was something he was going to have to accustom himself to, he thought, the way it did not flinch or apologize or perform itself for his benefit. She looked at people the way she looked at land, to understand what was actually there, not what she wished to find. "I am going to propose something practical, Mr. Abbott." "Go ahead," he said. "You need somewhere to stay while you are in Caldwell. The hotel is 40 cents a night, which adds up quickly. The house on this property is empty, and within the terms of the will, Chester Greer confirmed to me yesterday afternoon that occupying the property does not require the marriage to have already taken place, only that both parties have agreed to the reading of the will, which we have." "You went back to see Greer after you left," Harlan said. "I go back to verify things," she said, without apology. "I do not act on information I have not confirmed." He found he liked this more than he could easily explain. "What is the practical proposal?" "Stay in the house on this property," she said. "Begin working the land since it needs work and standing empty costs it. We can talk over the next several weeks. And at the end of that time, if we find we cannot abide each other, we will tell Chester Greer, and the land will go to the county, and we will both lose something we could have had but will at least not have bound ourselves to a person we cannot respect." She said bound, not trapped. He noticed that. "And if we find," he said carefully, "that we can abide each other." Augusta Redmond looked at him for a long, unguarded moment, and he thought he saw something in her expression that was not yet ready to be named, but existed nonetheless. A flicker of something that was not merely practical calculation. "Then," she said. "We will talk to Chester Greer about that as well." Harlan held out his hand, the way he would to close any honest agreement between people. After a brief pause, Augusta Redmond took it, and her grip was firm and her hand was warm and slightly rough with work, and she shook it once, twice, and let go. "7 o'clock," she said. "I keep early hours, as I mentioned." "So do I," he said again. The next 2 weeks were the most unexpectedly pleasant 2 weeks of Harlan Abbott's adult life, which was something he would later find remarkable given that he was doing nothing more glamorous than repairing a barn, replacing fence posts, and eating supper with a woman who had not yet decided whether she liked him. He moved his few possessions into the limestone house, which was cool in the August heat and smelled of cedar and old plaster. He slept on a bedroll until the third day, when he found a rope bed frame in the barn and repaired it and set it up in the main bedroom. And after that, he slept well for the first time in a long while. There was something about having a roof that was specifically his, even temporarily his, that changed the quality of sleep in a way he had not anticipated. Every morning he rose before 6 and worked the land. He repaired the barn on the adjoining property and replaced the fence line between the two properties with new cedar posts from the stand of timber by the creek, splitting them himself in the early morning when the air was cool. He found the cattle. There were 18 head on his uncle's land that had been running loose, he discovered, half wild and scattered, which meant his uncle had bought them as well and simply turned them in. And he spent 3 long days with Copper running them down and getting them back into something like a herd. He came to Augusta's gate every morning at 7, unless he was in the middle of something urgent on his own land, and then he came when he could and told her what he had been doing and why he had been delayed, because he thought she was the kind of woman who would accept a reason but not an absence. He was right about that. She was, in those 2 weeks, consistent in a way he found steadying in a way he had not expected to be steadied. She rose before him and worked until dark, and she did not complain about any of it, but she was not stoic in the grim, shut-down way of people who have decided the world will not hear their feelings. She talked while she worked, and what she said was worth listening to. She told him about the land's history. Her father had come to Kansas from Tennessee in 1868, after the war had taken too much from that country to make it livable for a man of his particular disposition, and he had filed a homestead claim and built the house with 2 hired men over the course of one summer, and had sent for her mother and Augusta, who was 9 years old, to come west on the train. She had grown up on this land. She had learned to rope cattle from her father when she was 11, and could sit a horse as well as any ranch hand in the county, which she said without any particular pride but simply as a fact. Her mother had died of cholera when Augusta was 16, which had narrowed her world considerably, but had also given her a kind of early competency. She had taken over the running of the house without being asked, and her father had relied on her in a way that was sometimes too much reliance and sometimes exactly right. In turn, Harlan told her things he had not told people in a long time, because there was something about her listening that made it easy. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and about his father, who had been a decent man before grief had made him smaller, and about the years he had spent working his way west, state by state, job by job, collecting skills and losing illusions. He told her about a winter he had spent in Colorado when the snows had come early, and he had been snowed into a line cabin for 3 weeks with nothing but hardtack and a week's worth of books, and how by the end of those 3 weeks he had read everything twice and had started writing letters to people. He knew long, careful letters about the land and the snow and the way the mountains looked, because it was the only way to push back against the feeling that the world had gone on without him. "Did you send the letters?" Augusta asked. "Most of them," he said. "Some of them I kept because they embarrassed me. Were you afraid of seeming too feeling?" She asked with a note in her voice that was not quite teasing. "I was afraid of seeming too." He stopped and looked at her, needy, I suppose, as though I needed people to know I was still there. "You were needy," she said simply. "You were alone and cold, and that is an entirely reasonable thing to need." He did not know quite what to do with the directness of that. He looked at his coffee cup. "You are a remarkably plain-speaking woman, Miss Redmond." "I find it saves time," she said. The first time she laughed, genuinely laughed, was on the 9th day. He had been attempting to explain to her mule, a small, deeply opinionated animal named Isaac, that the load he was asking it to carry was reasonable and equitable, and within the usual parameters of mule carrying. And Isaac had been expressing his disagreement through a series of increasingly theatrical protests that culminated in a sudden stop so absolute that Harlan had walked directly into Isaac's rump and sat down in the dirt. Augusta, who had come around the corner of the barn in time to see the last of this, made a sound that started as a controlled clearing of the throat and became a laugh she clearly had not planned. It was a real laugh, open and bright and unreserved, the kind of laugh that a woman gives only when she has forgotten to supervise herself. Harlan sat in the dirt and looked up at her, and he was grinning, which surprised him. "Isaac has strong views," he said. "Isaac has had strong views since the day my father brought him home in 1874, she said, still laughing. "He refused to move for 3 days. My father was never fully sure he had gotten the better of that negotiation." Harlan got up and dusted his trousers and looked at Isaac, who was now standing with the expression of an animal who has successfully defended a principle. "I respect him," he said. "Don't tell him that," Augusta said. "He'll get worse." After that, the laughter came more easily. Not constant, she was not a woman who laughed at everything, and he was grateful for that, because the laughter meant something when it came. But there was a warmth that grew in the spaces between them, in the daily work and the evening conversations on her porch and the mornings when he arrived, and she already had coffee ready, which she never acknowledged as a particular gesture but which he understood was one. On the 14th day, they rode together to look at the boundary of the combined properties, all 200 acres, hers and his uncle's together, and they did it on horseback in the long golden light of the late afternoon, and Harlan felt something he had not felt in so long that it took him a while to identify it. When he finally did, he sat with the feeling quietly, the way he sat with difficult things, and he thought, well, he was falling in love with Augusta Redmond. He was fairly certain she would find this an inconvenient development, or at least that she would be cautious about it, and he could not say she was wrong to be cautious. They had known each other 2 weeks. They were in an arrangement that had been constructed by 2 dead men with good intentions and no authority to meddle. The practical and the genuine were so thoroughly braided together in this situation that it was nearly impossible to separate what he felt from what he might merely want to feel. But he had sat in enough silence with enough honest things to know the difference between wishful thinking and the real article, and this was the real article. He could feel it in the particular quality of attention he paid her, the way her voice had become something he listened for, the way a piece of land well tended by someone who loved it bears the imprint of that love in its very groundedness. He did not tell her. It was too soon and she had not asked for it, and he was a man who had learned that the best way to ruin something good was to demand it become more than it was ready to be. But he was more careful after that, not distant, but more deliberate, more present, more precisely himself, because he had decided without quite articulating it that if Augusta Redmond was going to make a judgment about Harlan Abbott, she was going to make it with the fullest possible information. 3 weeks in, the trouble with the Haverford brothers arrived, as trouble in that country tended to do suddenly and in the late afternoon when a man was tired. There were 3 of them: Clem Haverford, who was the oldest at perhaps 40 and who ran the operation, and 2 younger brothers named Pete and Dobb, who were both large and not particularly thoughtful. They had a ranch of some 600 acres to the north, which they had built up through a combination of hard work and aggressive interpretation of property lines, and they had apparently been under the impression that the land formerly belonging to Jonas Redmond and the land that Chester Greer now held in escrow for the Wallace Abbott estate were both moving toward unclaimed status, since one owner was dead and the other had not appeared to work it. Clem Haverford rode up to Augusta's gate on a Tuesday afternoon with his brothers behind him, and a demeanor that had been polished to look reasonable, but was not. Augusta was at the porch, and Harlan was at the side of the barn when the 3 horses came up the road, and he walked around to the front because he was a man who did not retreat to a more comfortable position when company arrived. "Miss Redmond," Clem Haverford said, touching the brim of his hat with the courtesy that is sometimes more insulting than none at all. "See, you've got yourself a hand." "Mr. Haverford," Augusta said. She did not move from the porch. "This is Harlan Abbott. He is the nephew of Wallace Abbott, whose land borders mine to the west." Clem Haverford's eyes moved to Harlan with a recalculation that was not subtle. "Abbott, heard the old man died." "He did," Harlan said. "Shame," Clem said, without the inflection that would make it convincing. "We've been running our cattle on that west land some. It's been empty a while. Thought we had an understanding with the county." "You had no understanding with the county," Augusta said. "The land belongs to the Wallace Abbott estate, which Mr. Greer in town will confirm if you'd like to make the ride." "Be that as it may," Clem said, with the careful patience of a man who has a next sentence already prepared. "There's a question of water rights on that stock pond in the northwest corner. Our land runs right along that boundary. We've been using that water going on 8 months. "Then you've been using it without permission for 8 months, Harlan said, and his voice was even, because he had made a decision when he saw the 3 of them riding up that he was not going to be drawn into a fight he did not need. "I am not saying that makes you a thief, Mr. Haverford. I'm saying it's something we need to sort out cleanly going forward." Clem Haverford looked at him for a moment with the particular look of a man deciding whether the other man is genuinely calm or performing calm, and Harlan held his gaze steadily because the answer was that he was genuinely calm. "And if we can't sort it out," Clem said, "then we go to Chester Greer together," Harlan said, "and let the law sort it for us. That is what Chester Greer is there for." There was a moment where it could have gone in a different direction. Pete Haverford shifted in his saddle with the restless energy of a man looking for a signal that it was time to be physical about something. Harlan did not move, and he did not look at Pete. He kept his eyes on Clem. Clem Haverford was not, Harlan thought, a stupid man. He was a man who had gotten used to smaller resistance, but he was not stupid. He made the calculation and he pulled his horse around. "We'll come back when you're more settled in," Clem said, which was not an agreement but was not a fight, and the 3 of them rode back up the road in a small cloud of dust. Harlan watched them go. "He'll be back," Augusta said from the porch. "Yes," Harlan said. "He has been pushing at my fence line for a year," she said. "He lost 2 cattle of his that wandered onto my property last spring, and he decided that meant he had some claim to it. I wrote to Chester Greer about it then." She came down off the porch and stood beside him, watching the dust settle where the Haverfords had gone. "My father would have handled it differently." "How did your father handle things?" "He had a way of making people understand that he was serious without saying very much," she said. "He was a quiet man, but he was," she searched for the word, consequential. "When he spoke, people heard it as if it had weight." "I am sorry he is not here to handle this himself," Harlan said. Augusta turned her head to look at him, and something in her expression shifted briefly and deeply, the way something deep in the earth shifts before the land shows any sign of it above. "I am too," she said quietly, "but I am less afraid of the Haverfords than I was a month ago." It took him a moment to understand what she meant, and when he did, he was careful not to make too much of it. But he carried it with him the rest of the day, carefully, the way you carry a small lit thing against the wind. A week later, they rode to Chester Greer's office together and asked him what the legal situation was with the water rights on the northwest pond. And Chester Greer, who kept meticulous records, confirmed that the pond was within the boundary of the Wallace Abbott property, and that no easement or water-sharing agreement had ever been filed with the county. He drafted a letter to Clem Haverford that was polite and unambiguous, and the matter settled itself in the bureaucratic way that such matters settle slowly, without ceremony, and with the Haverfords remaining unhappy but legally outmaneuvered. It was on the ride back from town that day that Augusta said something that changed the quality of everything. They were on the main road, side by side on horseback, in the late morning of a September day that had decided to be beautiful about it, the sky clean and high and blue, the grass beginning to turn gold at the edges, the air carrying the first hint of coming autumn. "I want to tell you something," Augusta said. "All right," he said. "When I walked into Chester Greer's office 4 weeks ago," she said, looking straight ahead at the road, "I was prepared to be angry. I had spent the night before building up a very thorough anger about the whole situation because it was the appropriate response, and I am good at appropriate responses." He waited. "And then you walked in," she said, "and you were not what I had prepared for." He was very careful now. "What had you prepared for?" "Someone who would either be angry himself," she said, "or someone who would immediately start calculating what he was owed. Land, money, a wife." She glanced at him briefly, then back at the road. "And instead you said, if you want to walk out that door and leave the land to the county, I will think nothing less of you for it." "I meant it," he said. "I know," she said. "That is precisely the problem." The road stretched ahead of them and the horses walked, and the silence between them was not empty but was instead very full. "The problem," she said, "is that I came into this with every intention of remaining practical. And the last 4 weeks have been entirely practical in their substance, work and land and water rights and fence posts, and a mule with an aggressive personality. He did sit on my boot last Thursday," Harlan said. "He has done that to everyone," Augusta said. "Do not feel singled out." She paused. "The problem is that the substance has been entirely practical and the experience has been entirely not." Harlan looked at her. She was looking at the road. "Augusta," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the miss, and it landed between them with the particular weight of a first name used in earnest. She looked at him, and her expression was the most unguarded he had yet seen it, open and careful at once, the way a door looks when someone is holding it from both sides. "I have not done this before," she said. "I have not let anyone. I was careful. After my father died and I was running the property alone, I was careful about what I let people mean to me because I could not afford to be wrong about it." "I know," he said. "I know you were careful and I know why, and I am not asking you to stop being careful." "What are you asking?" she said. He thought about it the way she had taught him to think thoroughly, with honesty about what the thing actually was. "I am asking you to tell me if there is anything here," he said. "Not for my own comfort. I know what I feel, and I am not fragile about it. But because you said you are plain speaking, and I find I need you to be plain speaking now." Augusta was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the horses had walked them another quarter-mile down the road and the gates of her property had come into view. "Yes," she said finally, "there is something here. I do not yet know what to do with it." "You do not have to do anything with it today," he said. She exhaled a small, controlled release. "You are extremely inconvenient, Harlan Abbott." "I have been called worse," he said. The laughter was quieter this time. Not the bright, surprised laugh of the mule incident, but something softer and more private. And it was, he thought, the most beautiful thing he had heard in a very long time. The days that followed were different in a way that was subtle and enormous simultaneously, like the way a landscape changes when the light shifts, not in its facts but in its feeling. They still worked. There was always work. The fence line needed finishing, and the hay needed cutting, and the limestone house needed a new porch board on the south side. But something had been said between them, and the saying of it had changed the air. She brought him supper on the third evening after that ride, walking over the shared fence line at dusk, with a pot wrapped in cloth, and a look on her face that was entirely matter-of-fact and entirely deliberate, both at once. "I made too much," she said, setting it on his porch table. "You did not make too much," he said. "You made enough for two." "I made too much," she said firmly, and sat down on his porch step and looked out at the evening sky with the casual composure of a woman who is staying for supper without discussing it. He sat beside her and ladled soup into 2 tin cups he had found in the kitchen, and they ate together on the porch as the stars came out over the Kansas prairie. And he thought there had never been a more ordinary thing in the world, and he had never wanted anything so much. She told him that evening about a letter she had received from a woman named Mabel Stringer, who had been her mother's closest friend, and who wrote to her twice a year from St. Louis long, gossipy letters full of news about people Augusta had never met, which Augusta treasured precisely for their irrelevance. "She writes as if I know everyone she mentions," Augusta said. "I have never once told her I don't, because I am afraid she will start providing context and the letters will become shorter." Harlan laughed. "Have you told her about the will?" Augusta looked at him with an expression of acute horror. "If I told Mabel Stringer about the will, the resulting letter would take 3 months to write and would require its own horse to carry." "I would like to meet Mabel Stringer," Harlan said. "You say that now," Augusta said. On a Wednesday in the 5th week, 38 days after the reading of the will, with 22 days remaining in the 60-day window, Harlan was replacing the last stretch of fence on the north boundary when Augusta appeared at his gate on her chestnut mare, which was unusual because she generally called from her own porch if she needed him. He straightened up and shielded his eyes from the afternoon sun. Her expression was different. Not afraid, Augusta Redmond did not do afraid in the conventional way, but there was a concentrated quality to her face that was not entirely casual. "There is a problem," she said. "With the cattle." "No, with me." She dismounted and tied her mare to his gatepost and walked over to where he was standing, and she stopped a foot in front of him and looked at him with those clear amber-brown eyes that had been the first thing he had really noticed about her. "The 60 days," she said. "Yes," he said. "I do not want to waste the rest of them on performance," she said. "I have been practicing things in my head, what I might say to you when the time comes. Whether to be practical about it or to be the other thing. And it occurs to me that I have been managing the situation, which is what I do with things I am uncertain about. And I do not want to manage this particular situation any longer." "What do you want to do with it?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "I want to marry you, Harlan." It was so direct and so simple and so entirely her that he stood there for a moment without speaking, which was not a thing he had expected to happen. "Not because of the land," she said, "because she was Augusta Redmond and she was going to say the whole thing. Not because of the money or the practical arrangement or because your uncle and my father arranged it. Those things are real and I am not going to pretend they aren't. But they are not why." She paused. "I want to marry you because you walked into Isaac's rear end and laughed at yourself. Because you said I would think nothing less of you for walking away. Because you fixed the fence line and learned the land without being asked to. Because when the Haverfords came you stood still and did not look for a fight and I could feel that stillness like a wall." She stopped. "Because when you say my name I feel it." He had a number of things he might have said. He chose the truest one. "Augusta," he said, and watched her eyes change when he said it, "I have been in love with you since the day we rode the boundary together, and I have been trying to find the right time to say so, and it has just occurred to me that the right time was you getting here first." Something in her face opened completely, the last door, and she let it. He reached out very carefully and took her hand, the same hand she had shaken his with in Chester Greer's office, calloused and warm and thoroughly itself, and she turned it over and held his hand back. "I suppose," she said, and her voice was slightly different than usual, fractionally lower and fractionally unsteady, "that we should tell Chester Greer." "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed, and she did not let go of his hand. They were married on a Thursday in October, 1878, in the Caldwell courthouse, with Chester Greer as witness, and a woman named Mrs. Clara Finch from the dry goods store as the second witness, because Chester Greer had run into her on his way to the courthouse, and she had been the only person nearby who was willing to set down her parcels. Augusta wore her best dress, which was a deep blue-green that made her eyes look like something from a painting, and Harlan wore his second shirt, which he had washed the night before, and the ceremony was brief and exact, and neither of them looked away from the other during any of it. When the justice of the peace said, "You may kiss your wife," Harlan looked at Augusta to see what she wanted, because she was not a woman to be kissed without her own decision being part of it, and she gave him a look that was permission and instruction both, and he kissed her briefly and with extraordinary care, the way you are gentle with things you intend to last. Mrs. Clara Finch said it was the most sensible wedding she had attended in years, which she meant as a compliment and which both of them received as one. They walked out of the courthouse in the October afternoon sun, and Augusta was wearing a small smile that was private and deep, and Harlan was trying not to look as altered as he felt, which was considerable. "Husband," she said experimentally as they walked toward their horses. "Wife," he said back. She made a small sound. "Strain." "Good strange," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Yes," she said, "good strange." The $400 from the will allowed them to do things that needed doing. The roof on Augusta's house was repaired by a carpenter from town named Samuel, a quiet man who did excellent work and asked no unnecessary questions. The barn on the limestone house was finished, and the fence line around the full 200 acres was completed by the end of October, which was satisfying in a bone-deep way that both of them felt. They moved Augusta's things into the limestone house, because it was the larger of the two, though Augusta spent a full day first walking through her father's house alone, which Harlan understood was something she needed to do, and which she needed to do without company. When she came out, she was composed, but her eyes were faintly red at the rims, and she stood on the porch of her father's house for a moment looking at it, and Harlan stood at the fence and waited, and she came to him when she was ready. "We will keep it up," she said. "We can use it for the hired hand when we need one." "That is a good plan," he said. She looked at him. "You did not ask what I was thinking about in there." "I knew what you were thinking about," he said. "You were saying goodbye to your father again. You have been doing that every time you do something new. I expect telling him about it." Her expression was entirely still for a moment. "Yes," she said quietly, "that is exactly what I was doing." "I talk to my mother sometimes," he said. "When I do something she would have wanted to know about. I don't think that makes a person strange." "No," she said, "I do not think it does." She looked at the house one more time, and then she turned and walked with him back toward the limestone house, and she took his arm, which was the first time she had taken his arm voluntarily, and he felt it in his whole chest. The first winter was hard in the way that first winters always are in Kansas, not catastrophic, but consistently demanding. The temperatures dropped in November and stayed dropped, and the cattle needed feeding every day without exception, and the horses needed tending, and the fires needed keeping, and the water had to be hauled from the creek, because the well rope froze twice and had to be replaced. But they were good at working together, which they had established in the 40-odd days before their marriage, and which only deepened in the months that followed. Augusta had a systematic mind that impressed him every time he saw it working. She thought ahead. She anticipated problems before they arrived. She kept records in a small notebook with the careful handwriting of someone who had been taught that records mattered. Harlan was better at the immediate physical problem, the broken thing, the animal that needed handling, the decision that needed to be made in the moment without consulting a notebook. They were different in their approaches and compatible in their outcomes, which is perhaps the best a person can hope for in a partnership. The evenings were what Harlan thought about later when he thought about that winter. When the work was done and the fire was going and the prairie wind was doing its worst against the shutters, they would sit in the main room of the limestone house, Augusta with her mending or her notebook, and Harlan with whatever book he could get from the lending arrangement that the dry goods store had recently instituted, and they would talk or they would be quiet together, and both of those things were good. She was curious, he discovered, genuinely, restlessly curious about things. She asked him questions about places he had been that she had not, and she wanted real answers, not the summarized convenient versions. She asked him about Colorado and about the cattle drives and about what Abilene had looked like 5 years ago compared to now, and she listened with the focused intensity of a person who is constructing a picture in her mind and needs the details to be accurate. In return, she told him things about books she had read, which were more than he expected because her father had kept a small library and she had worked through it twice, about her opinions on various subjects, which were specific and well-reasoned and occasionally startling, about what she wanted, which she spoke about with the directness that characterized everything she said, but that still caught him off guard sometimes in its plainness. "I want this ranch to be good," she said one evening in December. "Not just functional, good. The kind of land that produces well and treats the cattle well and treats the people who work it well." She was looking at the fire. "My father was not always kind to the land. He worked it because it was what he had, not because he loved it. I want to love it." "I think you already do," Harlan said. She looked at him with a slight tilt of her head. "You are easier to talk to than anyone I have known," she said, in the tone of someone reporting a mild puzzlement. "Is that a problem?" he said. "It is unexpected," she said. "I spent a long time believing that people who were easy to talk to were either not listening carefully or telling you what you wanted to hear. But you are listening, and you are not doing either of those things." "I am just interested in what you say," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she moved from her chair to sit beside him on the settee that had been in her father's house and was now in theirs, and she leaned her head against his shoulder in a motion so natural it seemed like something they had been doing for years. He was careful not to make anything of it, careful not to move or speak in a way that would make her self-conscious about the gesture. He simply put his arm around her, and she settled, and they sat like that while the fire burned and the wind ran against the walls. And he thought, "This is what I wanted without knowing I wanted it. The particular warmth of a specific person, choosing to be near you not because they must, but because they will." By February, Clem Haverford had attempted to contest the water rights claim one more time, this time in person at the courthouse in Caldwell, and Harlan and Augusta had ridden in together on a cold morning and stood before the county judge, a dry, fair-minded man named Judge Archibald Poole, and presented Chester Greer's documentation, and the matter had been settled definitively in their favor. Clem Haverford had left the courthouse with the expression of a man who has been prevented from doing something he intended to do and has not yet given up the intention. But he had not tried anything further that season, and Harlan thought the combination of a clear legal record and the fact that there were now two people on the property, rather than one, had made Haverford's calculations come out differently. It was also in February that Augusta told him, one evening at supper, with a composure that had a slight tremor at its edges, that she was expecting a child. Harlan sat very still for a moment. "You are sure?" he said. "I am not someone who says things I am not sure of," she said, which was true. He was silent for another moment, and she watched him with the expression of a woman who has prepared herself for a range of possible responses and is trying to identify which one she is receiving. Then he got up from his chair and came around the table, and he took her hands, both of them, and he held them and looked at her face, which was trying to be calm and was not entirely succeeding. "Augusta," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am very glad," he said. "I am so glad I do not know what to do with myself." The tremor in her composure resolved itself quickly and completely into something that was not quite crying but was adjacent to it, and she pressed her forehead to his shoulder and he held her, and she said, muffled against his shirt, "I was not afraid exactly, but I am very relieved." "Were you afraid I would not want it?" he said carefully. "I was afraid of wanting it so much and having you feel differently," she said. "I have found that is a more practical fear than fearing the loss of the thing itself." "I want it," he said. "I want everything with you. Whatever you are willing to have, I want." She lifted her head and looked at him, and her eyes were bright with whatever she had been holding back, and she said, "I love you, Harlan Abbott." It was the first time. She had not said it before. He had said it once since the courthouse, on a cold morning when she had been standing in the doorway with the sunrise behind her, and he had not been able to prevent himself. And she had looked at him with an expression that was warm and careful, and had said thank you, which had made him laugh because only Augusta Redmond would say thank you to a declaration of love. And she had laughed too and kissed him briefly and gone back to her breakfast. But this was different now, the first deliberate offering of it without the cover of a tender moment or the excuse of being caught off guard. "I love you," he said back, and felt the absolute truth of it clear through to whatever was at his center. She touched his face with one hand, briefly and precisely, and then she straightened and sat back in her chair and said, "We should send word to Chester Greer. He will want to update the relevant documents." "Of course," Harlan said, and the laughter built between them again, easy and deep. The spring brought the calf season, and the ranch proved itself. The combined land handled the cattle well, and the grass came in thick in April after a wet March. And the herd, which was now 30 head between the original 18 of his uncle's and the 12 of Augusta's and 2 new heifers he had bought in February from a rancher passing through, was in better condition than either of them had seen it. They hired their first hand in April, a young man of 20 named Eli Vance, who was the younger brother of a woman who did laundry in town and who was hardworking and quiet and good with horses. He slept in Jonah's Redmond's old house, which Augusta had kept up exactly as she said she would, and he proved his value within the first week by single-handedly managing a fence break on the north boundary during a night when the cattle might otherwise have wandered. Harlan's relationship with Augusta deepened in the way that daily life shared with someone you love deepens a relationship, not through grand events but through accumulation. Through the 100 small negotiations of a shared life, most of which they made without argument and some of which they made with considerable argument, because Augusta was not a woman who conceded a point she was right about simply for the sake of peace, and Harlan had enough stubbornness in him to meet her, and they were both better at the end of any disagreement for having had it. She was right more often, which he would have told her if she had asked. She never asked. She already knew. Their son was born in October 1879, a year and 2 weeks after their wedding, which Augusta noted was very organized of him. They named him Jonah's Wallace Abbott, after both the fathers, her father first, because she had known hers longer, and Wallace second, because without Wallace's interfering optimism they would not have found themselves in any of this. Jonah's was a large, healthy, loud child who appeared to have opinions about nearly everything from the beginning, which Augusta looked at with something between recognition and amusement. "He is going to be exhausting," she told Harlan when the boy was 3 days old, lying in the crook of her arm with the concentrated seriousness of a new person deciding what to make of the world. "He is going to be magnificent," Harlan said. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at the two of them, and he was aware that his life had arrived at a place he had not known to aim for, which is perhaps the best kind of arrival. Augusta looked down at Jonah's, and then up at Harlan with an expression that was the fullest and least guarded he had ever seen on her face, love without management or supervision, or the careful rationing of a woman who has learned to protect what she values by not displaying it. "Look at what we made," she said. "I'm looking," he said. He was not looking at the baby. She noticed. She pressed her lips together over a smile that spread anyway. The years that followed were good years, which in the context of Caldwell and the Kansas frontier in the 1880s meant they were years of constant work and constant change and occasional catastrophe, but with a foundation solid enough to take the weight of all of it without collapse. In the spring of 1880, a drought came through that was bad enough to turn the creek to a series of pools and require Harlan to haul water twice a day for 6 weeks. They lost 4 head of cattle that season, which was a significant loss and a hard one, and there was a period in August when the accounts were tighter than Harlan liked, and he worked it through in silence until Augusta sat down across from him one evening with her own notebook and said, Stop trying to solve it alone. Here is what I have calculated. Her calculation was better than his, and they solved it together in an evening. That same year, Clem Haverford sold his ranch and left Caldwell for reasons that were said to involve debts in another county, and the new owners of the Haverford land were a family named Guthrie, a husband and wife with 4 children and no interest in territorial dispute, who turned out to be fine neighbors and who, when their daughter fell off a horse and broke her wrist in 1881, were grateful that Augusta had enough medical experience from years of managing a property alone to set the wrist correctly. In 1882, they hired a second hand, an older man named Roberto Alcazar, who had come up from Texas with a cattle drive and had decided that the drive could complete itself without him. He was in his late 40s, with a quiet competence and a dry humor that made Harlan laugh and that Augusta respected, and he stayed with them for the next 11 years. Roberto had come north because the Texas he remembered from his youth was becoming a different country under the pressures of settlement and law and the slow erasure of what had come before. And he did not discuss this directly, but it was present in him in the way that large griefs are present in a person, not loudly, but continuously. Harlan made sure he was paid fairly and treated as what he was, which was an excellent ranch hand and an honest man. And Roberto, for his part, was loyal in the specific way of someone who has found a place where being treated decently is not a surprise. Their second child was born in 1882, a daughter they named Margaret Clara Abbott Clara for Mrs. Clara Finch, who had been their wedding witness, and who had become, over the years, something of a fixture in their lives, visiting for Sunday suppers with the comfortable regularity of a friend who has been folded into a family without formal ceremony. Margaret came into the world with her mother's amber-brown eyes and her father's tendency toward stillness, and she had, from her earliest weeks, the air of a person who has arrived with a plan. The ranch by 1883 covered 240 acres, after they purchased a small additional parcel to the south from a family heading west who needed the money more than the land, and the herd ran to 60 head, which was a real cattle operation by any measure. They were not wealthy people in the way that wealth was counted in that era, but they were prosperous in the broader and more honest sense. They had enough, and the enough was theirs, and they had built it together from the ground that 2 dead men had seen fit to leave them. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Augusta sometimes read aloud to Harlan from whatever book she had borrowed from the lending arrangement, which had expanded considerably since 1878, the dry goods store having been replaced in this capacity by a proper lending library established by a determined woman named Mrs. Helena Burke, who had moved to Caldwell with her husband in 1880 and found the absence of a library personally unconscionable. Augusta read well, with attention to the rhythm of the language and a willingness to let the good sentences land rather than rushing through them. Harlan had developed a serious reading habit of his own, but there was something specific about the quality of an evening when Augusta's voice was the thing filling the room. He did not tell her this in so many words. He had learned in the years of their marriage that Augusta received some expressions of feeling better when they were concrete rather than abstract, and so he told her instead that she read better than anyone he had ever heard, and she had said, practically, that was because most people did not read aloud enough to develop the skill, and he had agreed with her and been entirely sincere and also deeply in love. One evening in the autumn of 1883, when Jonas was 4 and Margaret was 1 and the first hard frost had come, and the cattle were in the winter pasture and Roberto and Eli had gone to their respective lodgings, and the house was warm and specifically itself, Augusta put down the book she was reading and looked at Harlan across the room. He looked up from the harness he was mending. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited, because those words from her always meant something worth waiting for. "When I walked into Chester Greer's office in August of 1878, she said, I was completely certain that I knew what I wanted and what I did not want, and that the two categories were clearly labeled. She looked at the middle distance in the way she sometimes did when she was arranging something. I was wrong about almost all of it. He looked at her carefully. Wrong in what way? Wrong in the way that people are wrong when they have made all their decisions before the relevant information is available, she said. I had decided I did not want the kind of marriage that had been the only available model, my mother's marriage, which was functional but not this. She stopped. I had decided that the trade involved in being a wife was too costly, that what I would have to give up of myself was too much. Harlan was still, the way he was still when things mattered. And then, she said, I discovered that there is a version of a marriage in which you do not give yourself up, in which the person you are with is interested in who you actually are rather than in a version of you that is quieter and more convenient. She looked at him directly. You have never once tried to make me smaller, Harlan. In 5 years I have not once felt smaller in this house. He set down the harness very carefully because his hands were not entirely steady. I want you to know that I know that, she said. I know what that is worth, and I know it is not common, and I am not someone who mistakes common things for good things, but I am also not always good at saying out loud when the uncommon good thing has happened. She paused. So, that is what I am saying. The uncommon good thing has happened. He got up and crossed the room, and he sat beside her, and took her face in his hands, and he kissed her the way he had always kissed her, with care, and with absolute intention. And she kissed him back in the specific way of a woman who is entirely present in what she is doing. Augusta, he said against her temple, you are the finest person I have ever known. That is a very high bar, she said. You clear it easily. She made a small sound, and he held her, and the fire went on burning, and outside the Kansas night was clear and cold and full of stars. Mabel Stringer came to visit from St. Louis in 1884. Exactly as Augusta had feared, large, warm, enormously opinionated, and absolutely delighted by every detail of the situation, which she described to Harlan as the most romantic thing she had encountered in her entire life, including 2 novels. Harlan liked her immediately and profoundly. Augusta watched this with the expression of a woman who had anticipated an outcome and had mixed feelings about having been right. Jonas, who was 5 and had his grandmother's talent for immediate attachment, followed Mabel Stringer around for the entire week of her visit with the devotion of a small, extremely earnest shadow. When Mabel Stringer left on the stage to Wichita, she embraced Augusta for a long time on the porch of the limestone house and said, in a voice that was only slightly reduced from its usual volume, "Your mother would have loved him, Augusta. Your father certainly did." Augusta stood very straight and said, "I know." When the stage had gone and the dust had settled and the afternoon was quiet again, Harlan came to stand beside her on the porch. "Did it matter to you?" she said without turning. "That Mabel approved. Not for the reason you might think," he said. "Not because I needed the approval, but because she knew your mother and she knew your father, and there is something I am glad they would have been pleased, for your sake." She turned to look at him, and her expression was full and quiet. "Yes," she said, "for my sake." She put her hand in his, and they stood together on the porch of the house that had been his uncle's odd gift to them, and the land spread out before them, all 240 acres of it, gold and green in the late afternoon light, the cattle moving in the south pasture, the windmill turning slowly in the distance, the fence line running clean and straight to the horizon. 5 years of mornings beginning before 6 and days that did not stop for weather, and a mule with an aggressive personality, and a water rights dispute, and 2 children who were, increasingly, recognizable as the children of the 2 most opinionated people in Caldwell County. 5 years of the daily negotiation of 2 lives built in proximity, the small irritations and the large ones and the resolutions of both, and the evenings that made all of it worth everything. "Harlan," Augusta said, "yes. Do you regret it, any of it, the way it happened, the will, none of it being your choice at the beginning?" He looked at her. He looked at the land. He thought about it honestly, the way she had always required him to think about things. "The will gave me somewhere to ride toward," he said. "It got me in the door. What happened after that was mine, ours." He tightened his hand around hers. "I do not regret a single morning." She was quiet for a moment. "Neither do I," she said simply, and it was the whole of what needed to be said. The years stretched on ahead of them, more seasons, more calves, more evenings on the porch with the fire burning inside and the stars thick over the prairie. Jonas Abbott would grow up to be a rancher of considerable skill and better judgment than his years, and Margaret Abbott would prove her early heir of having a plan entirely correct, when she grew up to be the most organized woman in 2 counties, which was saying something given her mother. They would have one more child eventually, a second son, born in 1886, named William for no one in particular except that both Augusta and Harlan simply liked the name, which felt to them like a luxury and a pleasure, the freedom of naming a person for the name itself. Chester Greer attended William's christening and wept a little, which he attributed to the dust, and which everyone present allowed him to attribute to the dust because he was a good man and had been fond of both Wallace Abbott and Jonas Redmond, and had understood, perhaps before either Harlan or Augusta, what the arrangement in that document was really for. Eli Vance married the Guthrie family's eldest daughter in 1885, and the wedding was held at the edge of the Guthrie property, where it met the Abbott ranch, and Augusta made 2 pies, and Harlan said the longest grace he had ever said because he thought the occasion warranted it. Roberto Alcazar danced at the wedding with a lightness and precision that surprised everyone, and that he explained afterward was something his grandmother had taught him in a village in Coahuila before the world he came from had changed beyond recognition. And Augusta listened to this with the careful attention she paid to things that mattered and asked him to tell her more about it, and he did, and she was glad she had asked. There were hard years. There always were. A bad winter in 1886 took 11 cattle and collapsed one corner of the barn. A year when the cattle prices dropped so far that the profits were almost nothing, and they worked through the accounts together on the same table where they had always worked through difficult things. A summer when Jonas broke his arm in a fall from a horse, and the weeks of his recovery were long and trying for a child who had inherited both his parents' constitutive dislike of idleness. And through all of it, the constants, the land, the work, and each other. Harlan Abbott was, in the autumn of 1888, a man of 41 who had earned his quiet in the specific way of someone who has worked hard enough and long enough, and been changed enough by the right person to have arrived at himself. His hair had a streak of silver at one temple that Augusta claimed she did not notice and touched sometimes with her fingertips in a way that indicated she noticed it very well. He was not a man who had found it easy to be known, and Augusta Redmond, Augusta Abbott for 10 years now, had known him with a thoroughness that he had not sought and had needed without knowing it. He was, in the fullest sense of the word, home. Augusta at 35 was the woman she had been at 25 made larger and more certain. The same amber-brown eyes, the same directness, the same economy of word and gesture, but with 10 years of a life that had confirmed to her that the things she valued were worth valuing, and the things she had given her care to were worth the care. She was respected in Caldwell with the specific respect that accrues to a woman who has done real things in a real world and has not pretended otherwise. And she was loved by her family with the particular kind of love that is given to someone who is genuinely known, which is the rarest and best variety. On a morning in October 1888, 10 years to the month from the day they had been married in the Caldwell courthouse, Harlan found Augusta standing at the gate of the kitchen garden in the early light, looking out over the land the way she sometimes did when she was thinking something large. He came and stood beside her, and she turned to look at him, and she was smiling, not the surprised, bright smile of early acquaintance, but the deep, easy smile of a woman who knows where she is and is glad of it. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he agreed. She looked back at the land. "When my father arranged all this," she said, "he could not have known whether we would suit each other. He was acting on what he believed about your uncle and what your uncle believed about you and what they both believed about me. That is a great deal of faith in a chain of people." "They were right," Harlan said. "They were right," she said, "which means I have had 10 years of being grateful to 2 dead men for knowing me better than I knew what I needed." She paused. "I find that I am entirely at peace with that." "Your father would be pleased to hear it," Harlan said. "He would," she said. "He would probably also say something like, 'Well, what did you expect?' In that particular way he had. And then he would go back to whatever he was doing without waiting for an answer." "He sounds like you," Harlan said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, with the composure of someone receiving a description they recognize. "He does." Harlan put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, solid and warm, and they stood together at the gate of their kitchen garden in the October morning, while the light came up gold over the Kansas prairie, and the cattle were distant and moving in the south pasture, and somewhere in the house Jonas's voice rose briefly, and was answered by Margaret's voice, and then resolved into the ordinary sound of a mourning household. The land was good. It had been good since the beginning, and they had made it better. 240 acres of Kansas grass and creek and timber and stone, fenced clean and grazed well and worked with the kind of attention that was also love. The limestone house had been a house when they came to it and was now, thoroughly and specifically, a home. And in the particular quiet of that morning, with his wife beside him and his children inside, and the land all around them, and the sky overhead doing what the Kansas sky always did, opening itself with a generosity that never quite lost the power to stop a person and make them look up. Harlan Abbott thought about a man named Wallace Abbott who had bought a piece of land and drawn up a will and arranged 2 lives with the confidence of someone who fully intended the universe to cooperate. And he thought, "You old interfering man. Thank you." Augusta turned her head and looked up at him with those clear amber eyes, and she said nothing, and she did not need to, and neither did he. They had said everything that needed saying, and they had the rest of their mornings to say it again.